Dr. Munis D. Faruqui, members, guests, friends, I, on behalf of Vedanta Society, Berkeley, welcome you all to these holy precincts of Vedanta Society, Berkeley. We all are very happy that Dr. Munis D. Faruqui has kindly accepted our request and agreed to speak in this evening here in Berkeley Vedanta Society in the Living in Spirit series. Last year, we requested him to speak, but unfortunately, his mother fell very seriously sick, and at the last moment, he had no other way but to cancel the lecture. So we are very happy that at long last, this lecture is going to happen now here. So Vedanta Society Berkeley and UC Berkeley have been continuing a cooperative, collaborative and close relation since 2013, when both the institutions have organized Swami Vivekananda's 150th birth anniversary at the campus. Vedanta Society Berkeley is grateful to Professor Goldman, Dr. Sally Goldman, Professor Lawrence Cohen, and Professor Munis D. Faruqui for their kind help in arranging such kind of lecture series. Dr. Faruqui is the Director of Institute of South Asian Studies, Shara Kailath Chair of India Studies, and Associate Professor, South and Southeast Asian Studies. Dr. Faruqui is a historian by training and earned a PhD from Duke University in 2002. He primarily focuses on the Muslim experience in South Asia, especially during the Mughal period. In 2014, Dr. Faruqui was one of the 3 recipients of UC Berkeley's most prestigious honor for teaching, the Distinguished Teaching Award. His books include Princess of Mughal Empire, Expanding Frontiers in South Asian and World History, and Religious Interactions in Mughal India. His various articles have interrogated the relationship between religion and politics in the life and work of Mughal Prince Dara Sukoh, the founding decades of the princely state of Hyderabad, and the creation of the Mughal Empire under Emperor Akbar. He is currently working on a book on the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. I am sure that audience will be very happy to hear Dr. Faruqui, because most of our audience have the cultural relation with the topic he is going to speak right now. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Faruqui to deliver his lecture. And he actually committed last year when we fixed his lecture. He said that, Swamiji, I would assure you that your audience, your congregation will be very happy after listening to me. So I request Dr. Faruqui, just I am making it up. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Swamiji. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been at Berkeley for about 15 years now, and I think it's almost every day that I drive by this road on my way to campus between my house and my institute. And I've often admired this beautiful building from the outside, never having any sense of what it is like inside. And you have given me this opportunity to finally be able to not only, visit, but you were extraordinarily hospitable back there when I first came in. And I will certainly be telling my wife, who's also been as curious as me as to what this building is like and what the halls are like. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure because Swamiji is one of these extraordinary individuals, in my opinion, who understands the value of conversations that are expansive, that are not shallow, that engage not only his world, but also other worlds, including mine, among many others. And so whenever I see Swamiji at the Institute for South Asia Studies, either around talks that we are in collaboration with, it's always a pleasure to be in his company, and obviously to also have an opportunity to speak to all of you. So today's talk is about an aspect of my work that I've been engaged with for about a decade now, specifically an attempt to try to understand the life and times of this very extraordinary figure called Dara. He was a prince in the Mughal Empire. And what I'm going to try and do today, and I'll be a little clearer as I move along, is to try to render more complex his fascinating engagement as a Muslim with a tradition that you're all extremely familiar with, which is specifically Vedanta. So on that note, I will introduce you to, okay, and it has moved. I can't see if it has moved. Is it on the next slide, on the introduction? Okay, excellent, I'm with you.
Presentation mode, then it will be.
So it's just moving from here and here?
No,
Okay.
it will come.
Okay, and that's the animation over there.
Yeah.
But it's not appearing
Yeah,
over
I
here.
see that
Oh,
is
this is because I have to click it. Thank you. I'm good. Yes.
This is the first slide?
This is the first, and I think it should be.
No, just
maybe-
change it with that, yeah. It's coming.
It should just pull up.
It is displaying there.
Just just introduction. Okay, here we go. I think I'm good. So, I'll start today's talk with a remarkable event that occurred at the end of 1656, early 1657. There was a gathering of about 25 to 30 Pandits in Benares who had been commissioned to engage in a translation of the Upanishads into Persian. This was a group of individuals who obviously their whole life had been engaged by the study of various kinds of Hindu texts, but they had come to the attention of Prince Dara Sukoh as individuals who could help him translate a text that was in Sanskrit into Persian. And so he commissions this fairly large group, probably all Brahmins, but there might have been others in this group who were not, to engage in a specific kind of translation exercise. They worked furiously for about 6 to 8 months. Many of these individuals did not speak Persian, but obviously as Sanskrit speakers and undoubtedly as individuals who in their day-to-day life would have spoken some variant of Hindi, Hindvi, Proto-Hindi, you can call it what you want, Hindustani. Working with individuals sent by Dara Sukoh, they translated from Sanskrit into Hindvi and then onwards into Persian. And by the time you get to the early spring, early summer of 1657, this particular translation is complete. It is called Sir-e-Akbar, which for those of you who speak Persian might understand it as the Great Secret. Now, what was such a great secret? Basically, in summary, Dara Sukoh felt that he had found the original source text for all monotheisms. And he located it in the Upanishads. And that was why he was very interested in a translation of the Upanishads into Persian, because he felt that Persian speakers, most of whom would have been Muslims, would have had no access to this kind of esoteric divine knowledge, and he wanted to make sure that they did. Unfortunately for him, within a few months of the completion of this translation, Dara Sukoh finds himself in a war of succession. His father, the Emperor Shah Jahan, gets sick, and if you understand anything about the way in which the Mughal succession system worked, brothers fought one another to gain access to the throne, to be the next Mughal emperor. And so within months of completing Sir-e-Akbar, or a translation of the Upanishads, he finds himself in a war of succession that lasts about 1.5 years, and then in early 1659, about 1.5 years later, he's captured, he's brought back to Delhi, and he's executed. Now, his execution is not an extraordinary moment. This is what happened after wars of succession, around 1657, 58, 59. It happened in previous wars of succession. It would happen in latter wars of succession as well. But what was interesting was that Dara Sukoh was not executed as a political threat, but he was executed on the charge of heresy and apostasy. Okay? So I will return to all of this later. So today's talk, in a sense, really is an attempt by me to understand Dara Sukoh's engagement with this extraordinary text that we know of as the Upanishads, and to try to understand how he came upon this idea that the notion of divine unity, or Tawheed, is embedded in the Upanishads. It's a very interesting story. So there are essentially 4 parts to today's talk. The first is going to offer you some historical context on Muslim inquiries into non-Muslim religious traditions, and specifically looking at non-Abrahamic traditions. The second part of today's talk actually looks at one Advaita Vedantan's commentaries, and I'm specifically here referring to the 9th century commentator Shankaracharya, whose commentaries become absolutely crucial to Dara Sukoh's understanding of the Upanishads as a divine text, which offers itself as the source of all monotheisms. The third part of today's talk is going to be about his introduction to this text and the justifications that he comes up with to essentially explain why he sees this text, the Upanishads, his own translation, Sir-e-Akbar, as offering such a kind of momentous insight into humanity. And finally, I'd like to understand and share a few thoughts with you about why it's not sufficient to understand Dara Shikoh's career purely as a religious individual, an individual engaged in a certain kind of religious endeavor, but also to understand the fact that he was a Mughal prince who had very powerful political interests. And I'm going to try to explain how both a religious persona and a religious and a political persona, how they intersect in very interesting ways in the life of someone like Dara Shikoh. So part one, and this is about Muslim engagements with other religions. Islam, almost from the earliest moments of its revelation, encountered non-Muslim and non-Abrahamic religious traditions. And here I'm referring to, Greco-Hellenistic traditions, Zoroastrian traditions, Buddhist traditions, Hindu traditions. And it didn't take very long for Muslim intellectuals, a certain class of Muslim intellectuals in particular, to discover that the world that they are coming into is a world of immense epistemological plurality. It's a world in which truth seems to be everywhere, and everyone's asserting that their own religious philosophical system engages with the divine in one way or another. For many Muslims, intellectual figures, this results in what is called a crisis of knowledge, because they'd always been told that Islam is self-contained. Islam offers everything. You don't need to look beyond the boundaries of the Quran and the Islamic context to understand the world around you. And yet, for a certain kind of Muslim intellectual, it becomes very clear that this is not a sufficient answer. So for those people, there is this kind of crisis of knowledge. And it becomes very clear that in certain intellectual communities from the 7th century onwards, they reach extreme conclusions that basically we can call dogmatic skepticism, where they reject the existence of any true knowledge, or they reject the idea that you can ever comprehend true knowledge. Now, this is a very particular sliver of Muslims who just basically throw their hands up in the air in this world of intellectual diversity. But this was actually a kind of unusual response for a certain kind of intellectual figure. The vast majority of Muslims, beginning with the figure of Ibn Arabi, who was a very famous Andalusian mystic, basically argued that all religions have got the divine embedded in them. And Ibn Arabi pointedly notes that, you cannot argue that divine is present only in Islam and not in other religious traditions. He makes it a point to say that, every religious tradition has its own value in this world. But like other Muslim intellectuals, Ibn Arabi, this Andalusian mystic, is also pretty clear about the fact that in this hierarchy or the perceived world of philosophical and religious traditions, Islam does remain the kind of primary religion. And the way Ibn Arabi describes Islam's relationship to other faith and religious traditions is that of the sun in relation to stars. So just as there are stars in the sky, he says, that offer their light, and you can see them when the sun sets. When the sun rises in the morning, those stars have not vanished, they're still there, but their light is now part of the light offered by the sun throughout the day. And so Ibn Arabi makes an argument about how Islam is both, capacious enough to accommodate all those religious systems, even as it itself offers certain pointed truths. So for Ibn Arabi, there's both an accommodationist and inclusiveness, but also a sense of hierarchy built into his thinking. Now, you take Ibn Arabi's ideas and you mix them with the ideas of al-Biruni, who was a very famous ethnographer and a kind of pre-modern anthropologist. Really, in some ways a didact, autodidact. He was a self-taught man. He learned enough Sanskrit to be able to try to understand, what he understood as Hinduism. He represents the first kind of attempt by a Muslim intellectual to really get at Hinduism, to try to understand, what is this faith tradition and what makes it tick, so to speak. And he makes the argument that Hinduism is a lot like Judaism and Christianity, in the sense that he claims that, and this is something that a lot of previous Muslim intellectuals had, commented on, the idea of icons and idols. Like, why do they need this? And al-Biruni is the first person to really kind of pointedly suggest that these idols and icons are there not because Hindu elites or Brahmins are worshipping them unto themselves, but because these icons represent the ability of elites to offer very abstract ideas to uneducated masses. So, in other words, he's not asserting that Brahmins see intrinsic value in icons, but they use icons as a way to talk about a singular God. So al-Biruni makes the first kind of establishment that within Hinduism there is this possibility for the worship of a single God. Now, such ideas get picked up by other people, like the very famous poet and mystic Amir Khusro, who died in 1325, who, although he condemns idol worship, also makes the argument that Hindus in general believed in the existence of a single God. And again, he makes the argument that their justification for worshipping objects was derived from an understanding that everything ultimately is God's creation. So all of these early attempts to understand Hinduism are critical as part of a larger conversation that's going to take us down to the reigns of Akbar and then, of course, his great-grandson, Dara Shikoh. What I'm trying to basically argue over here is a certain Muslim perspective which is drawing on certain verses in the Quran, and I just quote this verse, that the true religion of God is everywhere. And these individuals will start to try to make sense of what I call epistemological plurality, and the possibility of a certain kind of parity between an Abrahamic faith tradition, that is Islam, and another faith tradition like Hinduism. So by the time we get to the life of the Emperor Akbar, and then most importantly his counselor and advisor Sheikh Abul Fazl, we have a certain distinct Muslim view that is infused with the idea that there is monotheism built into certain kinds of Hindu traditions and faith practices. In fact, Sheikh Abul Fazl rubbishes the continuing claims that Hindus do not believe in the unity of God. He says that this is a silly argument. To the contrary, he says that everything about, for example, and he uses this example of idol worship, is intended to focus the mind on the idea of a single God. So in someone like Abul Fazl, you again have a debt to this kind of skeptical tradition in Islam vis-a-vis non-Abrahamic religions, and a desire to seemingly work with non-Abrahamic traditions by trying to find a certain kind of resonance, a certain kind of echo between Muslim traditions, intellectual traditions, and non-Muslim traditions. And it seems to be that this idea is what carries on to some degree in the life of the great Akbar's great-grandson, Prince Dara Shikoh, the man who I am going to be primarily talking about today. So, talking about Dara Shikoh himself, let me just say he was a Mughal prince. He was born in 1618 to the Emperor Shah Jahan and his wife Mumtaz Mahal, who is, for some of you may know this, buried in the Taj Mahal. He was Emperor Shah Jahan's oldest son and also, in the end, Shah Jahan's favorite son. What really kind of distinguishes Dara Shikoh's life almost from the beginning is a deep kind of interest, intellectual interest in the world around him, and specifically a kind of interest in religious studies. Now, in the first part of his life, and I describe it as having two major parts. The first part is what I would call the kind of Sufi period of Dara Shikoh's life. This is from the time he becomes an adult in the early 1630s to the late 1640s. During the Sufi period of Dara Shikoh's life, he was primarily interested in focusing on the spiritual aspects of Islam and trying to understand, the nature of God, how God manifests, himself, herself, you can pick whatever, designation you want, in the world around him. And so in the context of this kind of intense engagement with Sufism, he writes a whole bunch of very important books, and he offers a whole series of very important insights that are peculiar to him and his growing understanding of mysticism in this period. Starting in the late 1640s, however, Dara Shikoh's study starts to undergo a major shift. He speaks about how Sufism's secrets and subtleties are a little inexplicable. He doesn't quite, they're not enough for him. Let's put it that way, put it simply. He feels that there is something that is missing in his understanding of the world and his attempts to understand the world that Sufism and a study of Islam alone will not help him achieve. And so over the last decade of his life, he increasingly begins to focus his attention on Vedantic philosophical texts and ideas. And he begins to commission a whole series of translations, Persian translations, of important Vedantic texts. He also begins to seek the company of what we could call Hindu theists, people like a gentleman by the name of Baba Lal, who was a Punjab-based spiritual leader. These endeavors increasingly convince Dara Shikoh that there is a kind of tawhidic or a kind of monotheistic core at the heart of Hinduism. And he says repeatedly that nothing but semantic differences or lexicographical differences, verbal differences, separate the study of Islam from the study of Hinduism. And if you can break through these kinds of vocabularies, which are in Sanskrit and Persian or Arabic, which are not necessarily intelligible to people in one community or the other, you can begin to understand the world in a more kind of subtle manner. He writes a very important book. This is his second last book. It's a book that is called Majmul Bahrain. Sorry, I'm not moving fast enough with my PowerPoints. Here is Dara Shikoh on the left-hand side, wedged between two gentlemen. One is holding a book and someone who's playing a musical instrument. Dara Shikoh is the guy sitting in the middle, and he's talking to Baba Lal, who's this Punjab-based theist. And it is interesting because the book that I want to draw your attention to is this book called Majmul Bahrain, or the meeting place of two oceans. It's a very interesting and very important book in the kind of life and career of Dara Shikoh, because in it, over the course of about 22 chapters, which include discourses about a whole set of different things, including the elements, the senses, devotional exercises, the attributes of God, the soul, divine sound, light, visions of God, names of God, resurrection, and salvation, Dara seeks to prove this notion that there is nothing but verbal differences, what he calls ikhtilaf-e-lafzi, between Hindus and Muslims. That between these communities, if you can break through these various kinds of vocabularies, you can begin to see the way in which they overlap. Now, inasmuch as Majmul Bahrain is a very important text, and it probably raised eyebrows both among Muslim and Hindu scholars, its shock potential was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the next and final work by this prince called Ser-e-Akbar, which was completed 2 years later in 1657. In this book, Dara Shikoh will espouse the claim that deep within Hinduism exists knowledge that can reveal the deepest secrets of not only Islam, but all of monotheism. And of course, the moment he makes this claim, he is flying in the face of centuries of Muslim dogma that suggests that, again, Islam is completely self-contained, and it's a perfect revelation. Okay, so you can see why this kind of inquiry is going to start taking him over the edge and over the boundaries in the minds of the vast majority of Muslims, even folks who we would perhaps call progressive or open to this kind of active engagement with non-Muslim religious traditions. So before I go any further into Ser-e-Akbar, let me say a few words about this extraordinary use of Shankaracharya's commentaries by Dara Shikoh. When Dara Shikoh decided to translate the Upanishads into Persian, he had more than half a dozen commentarial traditions from which to choose. He could have, gone with Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and other possibly more theistic Unitarian traditions to make many of the same arguments about the divine being embedded in the Islamic tradition in the Quran. And yet, he chooses Shankaracharya, the 8th century Advaita Vedantan, and it's a very unlikely choice. And this is why I believe that in some ways Shankaracharya is a strange and interesting decision, a choice by Dara Shikoh. Let me just say the Sir-e-Akbar itself is, again, a translation of the Upanishads. But it's not really a translation. It's really a conversation that is unfolding between individuals who are translating the Sanskrit probably into Hindi, Hindvi, Hindustani, and then it's being transcribed into Persian. In Sir-e-Akbar, depending on the manuscripts, and there are many manuscripts available in archives around the world, there are anywhere between 50 and 52 Upanishads in various kinds of manuscripts. And this just depends on the manuscript in question. 12 of these Upanishads are among the oldest and the so-called Vedic Upanishads. The remaining 40, though classified under Vedic categories, are compositions probably from later periods and are mainly of a devotional and or expository character. But a very important part of this quote-unquote translation is that Dara Shikoh, quite deliberately working with his commentating team, decides to leave out all sorts of markers. Okay? So there are no markers in this Persian text, organizational delimiters, adhyayas, khandas, etc. With the result that this omission of very clear gestures to what is commentating tradition, what is Upanishads originally, is not clear. So there's a real blurring of the lines between commentary and text. And it seems to have been a deliberate decision by Dara Shikoh in order to insert certain kinds of commentarial texts into this Sir-e-Akbar alongside the original narrative. And it makes reading Sir-e-Akbar very difficult. I mean, you really have to be someone who is extremely conversant with not just the Upanishads, but also with the commentarial tradition to understand where things are being pulled from in order to create this quote-unquote translation. While Shankaracharya is not the sole source of commentarial material in the Sir-e-Akbar, significant portions of the Persian texts of 9 Upanishads are in fact heavily interspersed with his commentarial work. And the 9 are listed on the PowerPoint. These bhashas, however, sit uncomfortably with the predominant number of theistic Upanishads of later medieval provenance that form the remainder of the Sir-e-Akbar. For it has been pointed by Surinder Das Gupta, Elliot Deutsch, Patrick Oliver, and others, the doctrines of Advaita, unlike Vishishtadvaita and the Dvaita schools of Vedanta, can be hardly characterized as monotheistic. In fact, Shankaracharya's explications on Nirguna Brahman, the absolute without qualities, and Saguna Brahman, the qualified absolute, suggest a very complicated relationship to the idea of God. For starters, Shankaracharya rejects the possibility that Brahman can be construed, to quote Elliot Deutsch, as a personal deity who responds to prayer, bestows grace, enters into history. God, Shankaracharya declaims, is nothing more than a mental construct, and a self-deceiving one at that. For all practical purposes, therefore, Shankaracharya argues that the idea of God does not lend itself to true philosophical and or meditational insight. Ultimately, Shankaracharya's anti-theistic polemic is too constant and too clear to be mistaken for theism. That Dara Shikoh or his Brahmin collaborators did not see through Shankaracharya, that they might have been misled by the frequent theistic references to Deva or Ishvara, is unlikely. This naturally then raises the question why Dara Shikoh relied on Shankaracharya's commentaries to validate his own ideas about divine unity. And this is where I'm going to it with this conversation. You see, I think that at the heart of Dara Shikoh's love affair with Shankaracharya's commentarial tradition was the latter's rather beguiling in the minds of Dara Shikoh talk of secret and esoteric knowledge that is embedded in the Upanishads. Shankaracharya argues that the Upanishads are the secret doctrine of all the Vedas. They are the highest secret doctrine even for the gods, he says. And one of the key proofs offered by Shankaracharya to validate this insight is an etymological one. He makes the argument, ignoring alternative possibilities, that seek to understand what the word Upanishad might mean, to say that rather than it being the root upa, near, and sad, to sit, or alternatively upa, near, or us, to sit before or with something, Shankaracharya instead makes the argument that in fact upa stands for near, ni stands for certainty, and sad stands for of splitting, destroying, loosening. And who's going to be the victim of that kind of destruction? He makes the argument it is those people who are seekers of emancipation but are unqualified to possess it. So there is a real notion built into Shankaracharya's commentarial tradition of this esoteric knowledge that only a few people should be privy to. It's not be shared widely with just about anybody. And it seems that this idea of esoteric knowledge was of extreme interest to Dara Shikoh and is what likely drew him to Shankaracharya's commentarial tradition. You see, at the end of the day, Dara Shikoh is trying to make an argument that the Upanishads are the source, the Sare Chashma as he might call it, of monotheism. Now, in order to make this argument, he has to be able to make an argument that the Upanishads are somehow embedded with this kind of deep esoteric knowledge that has not been shared with the world up to this point in time. Which takes me to the third part of today's talk, having to do with the introduction to Sere Akbar itself. It's a very short introduction to this larger quote-unquote translation. It's about 5 or 6 pages, but it's extremely dense and really kind of offers you a real understanding of Dara Shikoh's mind as he is trying to understand, specifically Shankaracharya's traditions and also the value of the Upanishads in relation to the Islamic tradition. It pronounces, and I'm talking now about the introduction itself, it pronounces that the Upanishads are a treasure of divine oneness, a Ganje Tawheed, and a crucial commentary on the Quran. But interestingly, Dara Shikoh in doing so is also asserting, in a funny odd way, Islam's claim to this scripture by arguing that this scripture can draw serious insight on Islam. He's also in a sense suggesting that this text has monotheistic value and therefore should be part of the kind of monotheistic tradition that he is a member of. So in a sense, what's interesting about this effort by Dara Shikoh is, coming back to this very singular point of trying to argue that the Upanishads are of a certain kind of extreme insider knowledge that he has found, no one else has, and that he is going to share with the world. So how does he go about doing it in his introduction? Well, his introduction is very interesting because it starts with a very short preface, a prayer to God and, the Muslim invocation to God. It then offers you a very short kind of autobiography of Dara Shikoh's life up to this point. It seeks to establish his relationship to his Sufi master, a man called Mullah Shah Badakhshi, the length of their association, about 17 years. And then it tells you something about Dara Shikoh's own intellectual journey. Now, as Dara Shikoh will explain, despite extensive research and writing, and he's here referring to his own life as a Sufi mystic in the 1630s and 1640s, he talks about how he, was trying to understand divine oneness and its source. And it is over the course of these 2 decades of trying to do so that he is increasingly filled with doubts. This is all in his introduction. Finally, the prince says he realized that in order to turn to the word of God itself, he needed to overcome a certain kind of personal distress. And the way to do this is to try to find answers in the Quran. So now you're beginning to understand his intellectual journey. It starts with the Quran. He says he started to read the Quran. He'd been doing so since he was a kid. But he found that the Quran had subtleties and enigmas built into it that did not offer him any answers. He then suggests that because the Quran, which he thought would answer everything, had failed to do so, he turned next to other standard monotheistic texts, specifically the Old and New Testaments. Unfortunately, according to Dara, because he only got them in translation, he could not read Hebrew and he did not have Aramaic. He depended on Persian translations of both the Old and New Testament, and he found that they were completely unintelligible. They made no sense to him. And so he says that, look, having tried to look at the Quran, the Quran was of no help to me. I then went to these other monotheistic texts. They were of no help to me. And so he says that he then began to turn elsewhere for answers. And it was on account of the unintelligibility of the Abrahamic texts that he began, and his frustration with these texts, that he began to look elsewhere. Now, what is interesting about Dara Shikoh's grouses, his complaints about Abrahamic texts, it's not that he was the first person to make this. I mean, this was, again, within the Muslim intellectual tradition. It's an old kind of quiet grouse. You don't say it too loudly, but there is this kind of long complaint that the Quran itself is just, it doesn't offer you any certainty. Like, for the kinds of questions that you're asking, you have to, there's a lot of subjectivity involved ultimately in terms of where you end up. And for Dara, this is a very frustrating place to be. And so he says that in a place in the late 1640s where he did not know where to turn, he decided that he was going to start to look in the Indian environment for answers. And the reason he does this is because, and he claims, that in India, discussions of monotheism are extremely widespread. He was also struck, and he says this repeatedly, that mystics and scholars of quote-unquote the old school, namely, older non-Muslim religious traditions in India, never objected to ideas about the unity of God, nor did they ever speak against monotheists. And it's because of this that he said, my curiosity was in a sense, piqued. And he began to undertake examinations of what he calls heavenly books, Asman, Kutbe Asmani. And these are, books that he feels will offer him insights into the ancient nation, Qawm-e Qadim, of Hindus. So what are these texts and where are they going to take him? In order to understand this, you need to understand one other kind of quote-unquote discovery that is made by Dara Shikoh. He argues that the Vedas were in fact revealed to the Hindus' greatest prophet, Brahma, who in Dara Shikoh's mind is none other than the prophet Adam by another name. So he makes an association between Brahma and the prophet Adam. And he says that there is a revelation to Brahma, quote-unquote, Adam, that I need to take a look at. And here he specifically begins to think about the Vedas as this kind of originary text that goes back to the beginning of the human experience. So although Dara Shikoh's suggestion that Vedas have this kind of divine quality is not particularly new again among certain circles of Muslim scholars, it is the association of Brahma and the Vedas with Adam that signals an attempt to place these scriptures squarely within monotheistic revelation. Now, in making this kind of claim, Dara Shikoh is beginning to step out of the outer limits of even radical Muslim opinion. Right? The argument that Brahma is Adam, that Brahma has had the Vedas revealed to him, and therefore, in a sense, the Vedas are an ordinary monotheistic text before obviously the Old Testament, the New Testament, and certainly before the Quran. So following on these assertions of a connection between the Vedas and Adam, Dara Shikoh next claims that the Upanishads, and he begins to focus very closely on the Upanishads, that they offer a synthesis or a khulasa of all the secret shlokas and contemplations of divine unity found across the first 4 Vedas. He offers his audience a crucial hint as to how he reaches this remarkable conclusion. And he says, without ever mentioning Shankaracharya by name, the prince claims that he had access to certain quote-unquote written commentaries that are of an ancient nature by prophets of Sanskrit that are unanimously accepted to be the best interpretations. Now, of course, that's contestable, because if you're coming from the Dvaita tradition or some of the other Vedanta traditions, you wouldn't see Shankaracharya as your man, you would see someone else. But Dara Shikoh is, in a sense, staking his claim alongside Shankaracharya. Now, it was these same commentaries that helped him, that's Dara Shikoh, understand the great secret of the Upanishads, the Sir-e-Akbar that becomes the title of his book. The prince claims that the Upanishads are in fact, and he says this in his introduction, he says that they are secrets to be concealed. Now, where is he getting this language of secrets to be concealed? He's drawing on Shankaracharya, it seems, this idea of a text that in his mind is a monotheistic text with certain secrets that necessarily have to be concealed from the vast majority of people. Now, Dara Shikoh attached great significance to this particular discovery of the Upanishads as a monotheistic text with a monotheistic character. Besides arguing that there was a deliberate plot over the course of centuries to hide this extraordinary text from, monotheists, but specifically Muslims, Dara Shikoh also claims that he had finally found the answers that he had been looking for all his life, that he could not find in the Quran, he could not find in biblical texts. They all now began to become apparent now that he had access to the Upanishads. He becomes convinced that the Upanishads are now not just heavenly books, but are also the spring and source of the ocean of divine unity. More crucially, and this is a very key point, and this is the point that's really going to get him into trouble, he says you can't understand the Quran if you don't read the Upanishads. That the Upanishads are in fact a commentary on the Quran, necessarily needed in order to understand the Quran. With this judgment that the Quran needs another text, a text that's coming out of the non-Abrahamic tradition, as a commentary, this will place Dara Shikoh out of the realm of Muslim opinion and will land him into a huge pile of trouble a couple of years later, as you already know. Now, how does Dara Shikoh go about defending this very unusual, idiosyncratic, and by all accounts, one that has been debunked by generations of scholars? But how does he come upon this idea, this connection between the Upanishads and the Quran, right? He offers a 3-part defense, and this is all in his very brief introduction. And I just want to quickly go through this defense because it really gives you a sense of how committed he is to this idea of the Upanishads as a commentary on the Quran. So the first part of this defense is a blistering attack on the Muslim ulama. He mocks the ulama and their claims to knowledge and learning. He characterizes them as the uninformed of the present age. He uses the word jahil, or basically ignorant, barbarian, unbeliever, to describe the Muslim ulama for their willful rejection of what he sees as a particular kind of knowledge. In using the word jahil, Dara Shikoh is connecting the ulama of his time with pre-Islamic Muslim communities in Arabia who were also part of what was called the Jahiliyyah. And it is in some ways the worst kind of scorn that you can throw on anyone by saying that you are part of a pre-Islamic community, these horrible people who used to, do terrible things to their daughters and this, that, and the other. And he calls the ulama this. And he says, because you're so uninformed, because you're jahils, you will never understand the kind of knowledge I'm offering you over here. So I don't take your criticism seriously, and I'm going to dismiss it entirely. That's essentially the first part of his defense, an attack on the ulama, a mocking of the ulama. In doing so, he also makes the argument that this kind of unbelief or kufr on the part of the ulama and their rejection of non-Muslim Indian monotheists is in fact contravening God's intention and God's will on earth. So not only does he accuse them of being ignoramuses, he in fact goes further by calling them unbelievers. Okay? This is not going to obviously endear him to anyone in the ulama class. The second part of his defense is actually an attempt to go into the Quran itself to make sense of what he has been telling us in his introduction. An attempt to clarify Dara Shikoh's interpretive reasoning is part of this second defense, and it draws on the Quran to legitimize arguments that Islam and Vedantic Hinduism are in fact part of the same monotheistic tradition, and that the Upanishads can shed light on the Quran itself. So he cites verses from the Quran, like Surah Al-Fatir, which basically makes the point that every community has exercises in divine unity. Every community has the divine. And he says, yes, see, in the Quran, it's saying that every community does. So whether they are monotheists or Abrahamic or not, every community does, and this is certainly true in the case of Hindu communities in India today. He then goes on to back up this argument by highlighting other surahs, specifically Surah Al-Waqi'ah's reference to a secret, hidden, protected book. Now, this is a very important point in his larger argument about knowledge that's hidden. The Quran does, in fact, talk about something called a Kitab-e-Maknoon, a secret, hidden, protected book, which has been revealed by God. Most Muslims believe that this hidden book, in fact, refers to the Psalms, the Torah, and the New Testament. That's how they square this idea of a Kitab-e-Maknoon, a hidden book. They say that it was a hidden book, but it's been revealed. Dara Shikoh rejects this. He says, no, that's not what is actually right. He also goes on to reject the idea that the Upanishads are somehow linked to this other concept, Islamic concept, called the Lawh-e-Mahfuz, which is a protected tablet. It's this kind of eternal, formless source of all revelations. He says, because it's eternal and formless, it can't be the Upanishads, which are an actual physical text. So he says that Kitab-e-Maknoon does not refer to the Christian and Jewish Bibles. The Lawh-e-Mahfuz does not refer to the Upanishads, because the Lawh-e-Mahfuz is kind of abstract idea of a revelation, but the Upanishads are very real. So in the end, it must be that the Upanishads are this hidden book that is referred to in the Quran itself. He makes this argument by also then pointing to the fact that he claims that on reading the Upanishads, all the kind of verses in the Quran that had been enigmatic, that had caused him difficulties in terms of understanding in years past, had now become clear. But there is a third and final element to this defense. And this has to do with Dara Shikoh's focus on his own role in drawing Muslim attention to a divine text that has been deliberately concealed from them. Now, by whom, you may ask, who's doing the concealing? Well, in Dara Shikoh's mind, there's only one culprit. It's the Brahmins, who have been sitting on this knowledge for centuries and centuries and centuries and not sharing it with anyone else. But the great Dara Shikoh has now come along to reveal this knowledge not just to Muslims, but to the world. And he says that thanks to his own efforts, Muslims can now lay claim to humanity's first historical witness to divine unity. Furthermore, he argues that his work vindicates the universality of the Quranic worldview by demonstrating how monotheism is echoed in classical, Brahmanical, and philosophical texts. Now, lest anyone think that God does not approve of all the things he's doing, he ends his self-defense by saying, and he provides an anecdote, where he says, when I began this translation project, I was filled with doubts. I was not sure I was doing the right thing. So I opened up the Quran to a random page to see if I could divine God's intention by opening it up to a random page and finding something that suggests that you should be doing this or you should not be doing this. So he does this, and his eyes alight on, he tells us. Now, whether this is true or not, you can be the skeptical audience, but he tells us the first phrases that he alights on is these verses, and I'm just going to quote them for you. A book revealed unto thee, so let thy heart not be oppressed by any difficulty. With it warn and teach the believers. Now, what is this referring to? Most Muslims would say that this book that has been revealed unto thee is a reference to the Quran that has been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet Muhammad has to now take this book and reveal it to the believers, explicate it, tell them what this great text is about. But Dara reads this as God telling him that a book has been revealed to him, the Upanishads. And now it's his duty to take this book out to tell them what the true nature of the Upanishads is and how the Upanishads not only clarify all monotheistic tradition, but are also this kind of remarkable originary text. The implication is clear. Dara is a prophet. Dara is a perfect man, an insani kamil, and he doesn't refer to himself as such, but it is pretty clear that no one has ever come up with this kind of insight. So he must be almost akin to the Prophet Muhammad. Okay. Now, moving to the final section of today's talk. Everything I've said to you so far has been basically focused on Dara Shikoh's religious personality and this kind of unfolding religious personality. But he also was a Mughal prince with a very clear agenda as a political figure. In a sense, to understand this story, you need to understand that the Mughals never had any rules of succession. Any son could achieve the Mughal throne, but you had to fight your brothers to get the throne, or your nephews, or any other male who happened to make a claim to the Mughal throne. Now, in this context, what did most Mughal princes do? When they became adults, they would end up invariably going as governors to provinces, they'd go as generals to places, they'd create personas, political personas, that would in a sense advertise what sort of king they might be. Right? So for about 15, 20 years from the time they give an adulthood as teenagers to the time possibly when the old man dies, they have about 20 odd years, 22 years on average in the 16th and 17th centuries, in which to make friends, to try to make arguments about how they will be the next great Mughal emperor. And most of them do it through generalship, administration, provincial governors, this, that, and the other. Now, what makes Dara Shikoh a very interesting character is that he is the only Mughal prince to never leave the confines of the Mughal court. For whatever reason, Emperor Shah Jahan never sent his favorite son on any sort of expedition outside of the Mughal court, with the exception of one to the city of Kandahar in present-day Afghanistan in 1653, when Dara Shikoh was appointed as a general to take back Kandahar from the Persians who had grabbed it from the Mughals. This campaign is a disaster, and he proves himself to be a really dismal general. And it's the only time he ever leaves the Mughal court. So now, against this backdrop, think about how he's going to possibly make a case to be the next Mughal emperor. He's not a military man. He's not a gifted governor. He's not a provincial administrator of any worth. So how do you, in a sense, make an argument to the population of India that you are a fitting representative of the dynasty and a worthy heir to the Emperor Shah Jahan? Well, and this is where I would make the argument that actually Dara's work in attempting to try to find this Kitab-e-Maknoon, this hidden text, making arguments about essentially getting to the very heart of what it means to be a Muslim and how to engage with Islam itself. This is going to be his calling card. It's of him, in a sense, as a kind of prophet, saintly king. A man with such great insight and knowledge that perhaps the only one who's a station above him would be the Prophet Muhammad himself. Everyone else basically pales in comparison to him. Now, of course, his argument is, I think, implicit in some of his work, but it is explicit in the writings of his beloved sister Jahan Ara, who calls her brother basically a diviner of divine knowledge, a man who has the capacity to bring both the spiritual realm and the temporal world into unison with one another. His followers refer to him as a saint figure, a perfect man, an insan-e-kamil. So even if he doesn't make the arguments himself, it's pretty clear that others do. And there are all sorts of ways in which they do this. One of the ways in which they do it is by highlighting dreams. Various followers highlight dreams that they have had of Dara in the company of the Lord Ram, in which one of the followers says, "And the Lord Ram looked at me and said, 'Dara is my brother,'" meaning Dara is the brother of Lord Ram. And these kinds of examples start to permeate the political, spiritual landscape of Mughal India in the 1650s, making this, I think, grand argument. Now, it is not an unworthy argument to make. And the reason it's not is because going back to the earliest decades of Islam in Arabia, following the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, the first few caliphs or successors to the Prophet Muhammad never led armies in the field. They sat in Mecca, they governed an Islamic empire, but they never led armies personally. And they were often held up as models for a certain kind of leadership. People who don't shed blood, but people who rule an empire. People who are spiritually incisive and, have access to knowledge that others don't. And I think that Dara Shikoh is trying to make a very similar kind of argument for himself. Now, unfortunately, and this is just how history ends up playing out, the book Sir Akbar is finished in the spring of 1657, early summer of 1657 actually. And within a few months of its completion, Emperor Shah Jahan gets sick. And the brothers of Dara Shikoh think that the emperor is dead, and they all basically gird their loins, to use an Indian term that I love, and they all start to march into battle. Now, of course, Shah Jahan is not dead. He was incapacitated, but not dead. Now, where does that leave Dara Shikoh? Sir Akbar, his great argument for why he should be the next Mughal emperor, if anyone knew about it, there were only a small group of people who did. You see, had Shah Jahan gotten sick or died, say a decade later, not in 1657, but say in 1667, there would have been 10 years in which Dara Shikoh would have had this text copied thousands of times, distributed among his followers, distributed across the empire, to make a case against perhaps his brother Aurangzeb and perhaps other brothers as well. But the argument never gets out. And it's interesting, we know that it doesn't really get out beyond a very small circle of his family and friends, because we know that there are only about 3 or 4 copies that get scribed before 1658, when he is actually defeated and is forced to start fleeing from his brother Aurangzeb's forces. So in the end, it's interesting because Dara Shikoh's argument doesn't go anywhere, and yet it comes back to haunt him. Because when he is captured in 1659 on his way to Iran, right on the border between the Mughal Empire and the Safavid Empire, and brought back to Delhi, guess what they do? They don't kill Dara Shikoh on the excuse that he is a political figure who threatens the Mughal throne and threatens Emperor Aurangzeb's right to rule the throne, which would have been a completely logical way of getting at your brother. Instead, they pull out a copy of the Sir-e-Akbar and they throw it on the table and they say, explain this to us. And of course, Dara Shikoh is trapped. He has no way of explaining it to the same ulama who are now sitting in judgment on him, who he had previously called Jahil. And they will, on the charge of apostasy and heresy, they will have him executed. And that, in a sense, is the end of the story of Dara Shikoh and his engagement with various kinds of commentarial traditions. Now, just as a kind of postscript to the talk, even though Sir-e-Akbar is not actually copied extensively in the decades after Dara's death, starting in the 18th century, it is very clear that there is a revival of interest, intellectual interest, not just in the intellectual elements of the Upanishads, but also in a certain kind of esoteric Hinduism. And so what ends up happening is that Dara Shikoh's Persian translation starts to get translated back into Indian languages and also into European languages, including Latin. And that is how European intellectuals in the 18th and 19th centuries begin to encounter the Upanishads. They're doing it through translations of Dara Shikoh's Persian text into European languages. And so even though he loses the argument to be the next Mughal king, there is a way in which he actually has the last laugh with this kind of transmitted knowledge that is going to become absolutely central to the 19th century revival of Hinduism, during the colonial period. Thank you very much. I'll happily take any questions if you have any.
When I was in India at the Nizamuddin Dargah, one of the daughters of Shah Jahan was buried there. How many daughters did he have?
The Emperor Shah Jahan had a bunch of daughters, but two were prominent, the most prominent being his Jahanara, his oldest daughter. And Jahanara is buried in Delhi. She is actually, interestingly, Dara Shikoh's soulmate. The two were extremely close to each other. They shared Mullah Shah Badakhshi, the gentleman that I was talking about, the Sufi gentleman I was talking about, as a master. And she was all in on whatever Dara was up to throughout the various decades of his life. Jahanara was part of this kind of intellectual journey with her brother. Of course, when her brother is executed, Jahanara, who had been the most powerful woman in the Mughal Empire after her mother's death in the 1630s, finds herself being sidelined for about 6 or 7 years by her other brother Aurangzeb, who has now taken the throne, the Mughal throne. So she goes and takes care of her father, who's imprisoned in Agra. But when he dies in 1666, Aurangzeb forgives his sister, and Jahanara comes back to the Mughal court and rejoins the royal family. And in the last decade and a half of her life, she dies in 1681, she becomes perhaps one of the most interesting figures in the royal family, because she becomes this kind of figure who brings a fractured family together. She becomes the patron of all sorts of marriages. She is the one who pays for these marriages of various kids of brothers who have been killed in the war that had just transpired. And in the end, she's given a very honorable and fitting burial when she dies in 1681. It's Jahanara that we are talking about.
Her burial is at the feet of Nizamuddin.
That's right.
Did Shah Jahan have the blessings of Nizamuddin?
No.
They lived in America. I'm sorry.
So Nizamuddin dies in the 1300s, in the early 1300s, but he is the greatest master of the Chishti order. And the closer you are buried to one of these, kind of saintly figures, the more likely it is that they will intercede for you at the time of your death to be allowed into heaven. And so the closer you can get to one of these saints' graves and be buried, the more honorable and prestigious it is for you.
Just one last question.
Sure.
I read the Quran when I was at the Majapatila place for Tibetans, and when I read some class, it said that Aurangzeb was always seeking the blessings of these saints. And then there was one buried at the Jama Masjid, which interested me because he was Jewish born.
Yes.
And he went with the Silk Route and then became God intoxicated. So apparently the way the story goes, and as a Westerner, I can only penetrate so far. He enraged Aurangzeb because he didn't wear clothes. And Aurangzeb cut off his head. But he seems to have been a master of Khandana yoga, so he walked up the steps of the mosque carrying his head, asking for divine justice. And then his guru from on high says, drop the head or there will be great bloodshed. And your lecture looks like there's much that I could learn. Was Aurangzeb seeking blessings from saints? And could he have not gotten the blessing? Because they say one time, he said, Sarmat Sahib, Jewish born, said, if you have a problem with my nakedness, here's a blanket, cover me. And he picked up the blanket and he saw all the people he murdered to get into that position. And then the saints might be coming to make a rectification of all of the blood that was shed.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm only speculating.
So Sarmad is a really interesting character. For those of you who have never encountered Sarmad before, he's this Jewish Armenian who wanders across, the Middle East through Iran, ends up in India, falls in love with a young boy, and is in this kind of intoxicated religious state, living in Delhi. And as part of a certain kind of antinomian quality, incidentally, he's the guy who translates the Hebrew Bible into Persian for Dara Shikoh, but it makes no sense to Dara Shikoh. The translation makes no sense to him. But so Sarmad is a very important interlocutor for Dara Shikoh, both intellectually, but also otherwise. And so what ends up happening is so he has this close association, but there were many others who had a close association with Dara Shikoh, intellectual association as well, who are not punished. One of them being Mullah Shah Badakhshi, the master of both Jahanara and Dara Shikoh. He comes, he does darshan to Aurangzeb. In other words, he basically kowtows to Aurangzeb, and Aurangzeb says, okay, what do you want to do? And he says, I just want to retire, if I can. And he says, you can retire, and he goes off to Kashmir, and he dies a few years later. Sarmad, by contrast, refuses to kowtow. And I don't think it's because of any sort of religious value. He just did not want to kowtow to a king. He did not want to kowtow to Aurangzeb, certainly. And in the end, the threat to someone like Aurangzeb's power of a character like Sarmad openly rejecting Aurangzeb's authority and allowing him to get away with that kind of rejection after also being seen as an extremely partisan supporter of Dara Shikoh was something that Aurangzeb was not going to countenance. And so Sarmad is executed, and he's buried, at the Jamia Masjid. Now, Aurangzeb does not seem to have had any problems with other people who were involved in some of Dara Shikoh's intellectual endeavors. He doesn't execute them. He, sends a couple of them off into exile. The majority of them end up, being folded back into the Mughal state in various capacities. And in terms of his own relationship to Sufi saints, Aurangzeb begins to fashion himself, much like, and this is the curious irony, and this is something that most people are not aware of. Inasmuch as Dara Shikoh is fashioning himself as a perfect man, by the end of Aurangzeb's life, he begins to fashion himself also as a kind of Zinda Pir or living saint. And if any of you have ever seen images of Aurangzeb toward the end of his life, he's always dressed in white, he's always reading the Quran, he's always in prayer. And this was part of his attempt to, if not appropriate, because I don't think he's trying to appropriate Dara's legacy, but it's part of what you need to do to be seen as an overarching king, which is to be politically powerful but also saintly. Dara was striving for it, and ironically, by the end of Aurangzeb's life, his own followers are calling him Pir-e Dastagir Alamgir, the great Pir of the age, the saint of the age, Alamgir, which was his coronation name. So he has no problem with Sufi saints, and he's constantly giving them land and monies, to keep themselves going. So,
said that the Upanishads, clarify or correct a lot of Quran or whatever you said, something to that effect. The part of the question is how much currency did Dara Shikoh's works have in Iran and in the Middle East, and how much did the Muslim scholars, say in Al-Azhar or whatever the name of the universities in Egypt, how much of they accepted these things? And how did, and finally the same thing is, how did and how much of the Upanishads went to Europe? Did it go to Latin translation of the Quran more than anything else?
That's it. So the second answer is yes. And to answer your first question, it has almost no influence on the lands to the west. It's lost. It's really lost for about 50 years. And it only gets resurrected again as a text of value in the 18th century. And I just want to say this because I think it's an important point to make. Dara has often been seen as the kind of good Muslim, whereas Aurangzeb is the bad Muslim, right? These two brothers are locked in this kind of Sherlock Holmes, Moriarty, going over the waterfall kind of phenomena. What's really interesting is that inasmuch as it's clear to us that the Muslim ulama reject his work by the end, it's also very interesting that his work has almost no currency among Hindu scholars, Pandits and others. They also reject his work. And nowhere is this more apparent than when the War of Succession breaks out. Some of the big, most of the big Rajput rulers end up fighting with Aurangzeb or his brothers against Dara Shikoh. It is not inconceivable to think that Dara Shikoh's work freaked them out as well. Because if you think about the implications of his work, right, which is to say that the Upanishads is basically a forerunner for all monotheistic texts, what he's basically saying is that Hinduism is Islam. Some parts of Hinduism, the theistic elements of Hinduism, can be accommodated into Islam. Now imagine this man had become the next Mughal emperor with this command that, hey, you monotheistic Hindus out there, theists and Unitarians and others, I have shown you the truth. Islam remains the primary religion, but I have shown that your faith is part of an Islamic tradition, so you should become Muslims. What's lost by you becoming Muslims? Now, what if you had said, no, I don't want to become a Muslim? But then he, as the great Mughal emperor, would have been forced to punish you because he is, after all, in a sense, a godhead. And he has revealed the truth to you. So, it's really interesting. This is counterfactual history. This is not based in anything. We don't know what his reaction would have been. But the logical implications of what he was doing seems to have been very apparent to a lot of the Pandits who were if not working with him, certainly in communities elsewhere across northern India, because they do not pick up on his work. They do not say, oh my goodness, this is amazing work. Let's work with it. They, in fact, are quite happy to also put it in the almari, lock it, and throw away the key. So this is a very interesting part that we actually have never really considered about Dara Shikoh, that inasmuch he has this extraordinary capacity, right, to go well beyond a certain constrained intellectual tradition, the implications of this are also, I think, very interesting to consider further. So the gentleman in blue at the back and then the gentleman in front. So, oh, please.
Sir, I thought, by and large, politics and religion during those days, they were going together. For example, Alauddin Khilji and Akbar, they started their own religion because they thought they would all aid Prophet Muhammad by starting a religion. I thought maybe Dara Shikoh also wanted to start a religion and gain currency, and as you correctly said, wanted to get the acceptance of the thing. I thought, like Akbar, he wanted to follow Akbar or Alauddin Khilji.
Thank you for that. That's a great question. You see, I think that what Akbar is doing is quite different from what Dara Shikoh is doing. If anyone is a true humanist, and I'm saying this as someone who studies this period very closely, Akbar is the most fascinating figure of all. He truly is a humanist. He truly is approaching other religious traditions not with any sort of coercive intention. It's truly to understand and to really, have people engage with each other in the world of ideas. And he was not, I don't think that Akbar has a prejudiced bone in his body. If he does, it's not very apparent to us. It is interesting, we always think of Akbar and then we think of Dara Sukoh as the two who are kind of linked one to the other. Dara writes 19 books, he never mentions Akbar, not once. Not once. So it seems clear to me that Dara doesn't see himself as part of the Akbar tradition, even though the majority of us today link the two in our heads together. Akbar was doing something different, and Dara does not see himself doing what Akbar was doing. And the reason is that whereas Akbar seems to have disavowed Islam in his personal life, okay, he was a Muslim ruler and he had to do what he had to do, but in his personal life, Akbar had basically given up on Islam. Dara Sukoh has not given up on Islam. Dara remains a very committed Muslim right to the end. And I would argue that a lot of what Dara is doing is actually intended to fortify Islam, not to diminish or to take away from, Islam's, philosophical, religious value system. And that is why in 19 books he never mentions Akbar, because he understood what Akbar was up to and he doesn't see himself in the Akbarian tradition. So is he trying to start a new religion? I think Akbar may have been trying to create an imperial cult. Maybe not a religion, but an imperial cult. Dara is not trying to create an imperial cult or even a new religion. He is trying to actually fortify Islam by drawing together all these strands that he thinks are kind of free-floating and out there, that should not be out there, that should be rightfully within an Islamic tradition and acknowledged both by Muslims but also by non-Muslims as part of a singular tradition. So I actually think he is not trying to create a new religion. He is trying to do something with Islam in the mold of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, Akbar is not placing himself in that lineage. Akbar doesn't say, I'm, like the Prophet Muhammad. Akbar is like, I'm doing my own thing, And that's what I think is the difference between the two men. We just gently and then you.
First one is, where did he learn Sanskrit? So who gave him the...
He never learned Sanskrit.
So how did he actually acquire the true meaning of Upanishad? That's what it's And the second one is, when he was actually being executed, was there any historical commentary about what he actually offered as an argument before he got actually executed against the same Munis who declared their community on him? So is there any historical argument that says, oh, I did this because of this A, B, and C?
So, no. So to answer the second question first, there is no argument that is offered at his trial that has survived to the present. Now, he may have made arguments, but you can imagine if you've read the book, Sir Akbar, the introduction to Sir Akbar, whatever he would have said would have been said loudly and furiously. Now, would you want a transcript of that to go out into the public? No, you wouldn't. So you would have kept that, you would have forgotten that knowledge. It would have not been scribed, or if it was scribed, it would have been destroyed. So we don't know what transpired during his trial, but he's a feisty character, and you can imagine, and he thinks he's God. I mean, he has a certain kind of semi-divine character about him. So you can imagine that he would have been very committed to this line of argument. To answer your first question, he does not have any access to Sanskrit. None. So he is working with teams of Pandits sitting in Banaras who are reading the Sanskrit, translating it into Hindvi or Hindustani or Proto-Hindi, call it whatever you want, Awadhi, Braj, some in one of these languages. And then there are people sitting on the other end who are Persian speakers, some of whom, like Chandraban Brahmin, would have been highly erudite Persian speakers, but also coming from within, the Hindu tradition and very knowledgeable about the Hindu tradition, but primarily scholars of Persian, not Sanskrit. So you've had people like Chandraban possibly, who would have had access to Persian and Sanskrit, but the vast majority of the work would have been transcribed between three communities of speakers: Sanskrit, Hindvi, and then Persian speakers. And invariably, the people who are Persian speakers can speak, Hindi as well. The Sanskrit speakers can also speak Hindi, and that's where the arguments are taking place. कि यार इसमें क्या लिखा है? I don't understand what you're saying. So is this mean this? And that conversation is not happening in Persian or Sanskrit. It's happening in Hindi. And then once you understand, as the Persian scribe, or commentator, once you understand, okay, this is what you mean, then it gets written into Persian. This perhaps explains to some degree the complete, trying to read the Sir Akbar and knowing what is, actually the 52 Upanishads and what's the commentarial tradition is very difficult. And it could be that this was a deliberate thing by Dara. He just wanted it all to be kind of mixed up. So you can insert commentarial tradition anywhere. No one can say, hey, you can't put commentary over here. This doesn't make sense. That could be one possibility. The second possibility is that the people who are actually working with the stuff were themselves very confused because of the nature of quote-unquote translation. So, gentlemen.
My question is about Darashiko's daughters, which you may know, but that's the second question. My other question is about you. I have very competent interns, and I myself could not find your background information, and I have deep ones in Pakistan, the political class. I spoke to Maryam Nawaz Sharif and Shehla Raza. They don't know who you are. I was surprised you taught a class in Pakistan. So where are your grandparents from?
So my family is originally from Lucknow.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Very, very good.
So they're from Lucknow, and it's probably a good thing that the political elites of Pakistan know nothing about me. It gives me a lot more freedom to do whatever I want to do and to meet who I want to meet without any reference to anything that's happening in the contemporary environment.
They're all decent people, don't worry about that.
I'll believe you.
No, there are Shiko's daughters. There's a lot of story that they were lost in the Chittagong in tracks, then moved to Arakan, which is where the Rohingyas live now. And so it's 350 years ago. People now think that Rohingyas are actually descendants of those girls. Do you know anything about his progeny?
I can say for certain that the Rohingya are not progeny of the Mughal royal family. One of his brothers, Shuja, who was governor of Bengal for about almost 20 years in the 1640s and 1650s, after he's defeated, he flees to Arakan with his immediate family and a few soldiers and bodyguards. And he's killed in Arakan by the ruler of Arakan, who thinks that he's trying to maybe, grab the throne from him. So Shuja's family is killed. No one that we know of survives. There are periodically people in the 17th and 18th centuries who appear, especially in Bengal and Bihar, claiming to be sons or daughters of Shuja, but they're all pretenders, and none of them make any headway in terms of, overcoming Aurangzeb or even, getting to Delhi. In terms of Dara Shikoh's daughters, it's very interesting because one of the happiest love marriages, none of these marriages are love marriages, but one of the happiest marriages on record is between Dara Shikoh's daughter, Jahanzeb Banu Begum, and one of Aurangzeb's sons called Azam. So they're first cousins, and as part of an attempt to kind of knit the family back together, you have a whole bunch of first cousin marriages between the defeated brother's kids and Aurangzeb's kids. And this happens in the 1670s and 1680s, and the person who's presiding over the vast majority of these weddings is Jahanara. So his son Azam, who's his second son, Aurangzeb's second son, marries Jahanzeb Banu Begum, who is the daughter of Nadra Begum and Dara Shikoh. And by all accounts, they had a wonderful marriage. And Jahanzeb Banu Begum, who I'm actually writing something about right now, is an extraordinarily formidable character, much like her father. And it's quite an interesting story of her love and her importance in Prince Azam's life. So none of the daughters are executed. They all get married back into the royal family as part of an attempt to knit the family back together, biologically speaking, at least. So,
Thank you for your talk. So, I'm not really convinced about the part 4 of where you say that your also had a political agenda. And you have given some inferences from what he was thinking about, possibly. But I'm not convinced that, is there any record like he had a strong political will to attraction to the throne or something? I don't see like he's doing all these things for a purpose, even for what if I'm Islam or,
Yeah, no. I mean, look, this is precisely why, in some ways, my talk has a kind of speculative quality at the end, right? At no point in his own writing does he say, I'm doing all of this because I want to be the next Mughal emperor. He never says that. He's never so crass to say anything like that, right? But it is pretty clear from the reactions of his sister and some of his followers that they understand that this work that he is doing is absolutely central to an argument that is going to be eventually made for why he is utterly deserving to be the next Mughal emperor after Emperor Shah Jahan. And beyond that, Dara Shikoh himself is extremely ambitious politically, and he was very sharp-elbowed. So, when you read some of the 19th century British colonial accounts of Dara Shikoh, it's really fun to read them because, these accounts always present him as this kind of, deep intellectual figure by the candlelight, reading things, and he was not interested in the throne. If you read Aurangzeb's correspondence as a prince, and his correspondence as a prince, a large part of it has actually survived. It is really interesting. Aurangzeb is constantly writing letters to Shah Jahan and Jahanara, complaining about Bada Bhai, basically about Dara Shikoh, and all the ways in which Dara Shikoh is undermining him and hurting him politically. The most grating example, to give you one, is that in 1656, just before Shah Jahan gets ill, and no one knows that Shah Jahan is going to get ill the next year. 1656, Aurangzeb is governor of the Deccan. He's based in Aurangabad. There are two Deccan sultanates south of the Mughal Empire, Golconda and Bijapur. And Aurangzeb wants to attack them. Prince Aurangzeb does. He does as an emperor later on, but as a prince he does. Now, why does he want to attack them? Because he wants to take their money. And with this money, he's going to have basically a full treasury to pay the mercenaries and all the soldiers he's going to need when this big war of succession hits him. Because he's not rich. He doesn't have a huge amount of money. Dara Shikoh understands exactly what his brother is up to. So Aurangzeb begins an attack on Bijapur, and as he's attacking Bijapur and winning, Dara is sending secret emissaries to Bijapur, basically telling them that, don't worry, I've got your back, I'm going to speak to the emperor, I'm going to get these armies recalled. And that's exactly what happens. Emissaries go up from Bijapur to Delhi, to Shah Jahanabad, to Shah Jahan himself, and Shah Jahan accepts their arguments that they have to pay a big tribute, not to Aurangzeb, whose armies are forced to withdraw, he recalls them, but to Shah Jahan himself. And guess who's going to get their hands on that money? It's going to be Dara, because he's at the Mughal court. Aurangzeb is livid. I mean, his letters are, if you could imagine, a vein popping over here or, something horrible happening to the man. He was so angry that his brother had done this to him and that his brother had basically outwitted him, checkmated him at this moment when he thought, I'll have, tens of millions of rupees to do whatever I need to do to fight for the throne. So Dara is doing this all the time, and he's doing it to all his brothers. So much so that by the time you get to 1657, and when Shah Jahan gets sick, all his brothers unite to take him out first. So they all know that he is a big threat to their political ambitions, and that he is not the guy who, basically, if you just give him a small little cave somewhere in Kashmir, he will retreat to Kashmir and just keep working on his books and he'll be happy over there. They don't believe it for a second. So he has a very powerful political persona that he is then going to wed with basically what I'm talking about over here, this kind of religious persona. Now, I don't want to be totally functional about this in the sense that I don't want to say that, look, we become religious because we are trying to become directors of the Institute for South Asia Studies, right? Or we start to do certain things because we have political ambitions, or we have this ambition or that ambition. Invariably, look, for someone like Dara, he is an intellectual. He is deeply interested in philosophical questions from the time that he was undoubtedly a teenager. The question then is that, he's also a prince. How do you, in a sense, bring these two personas together? I don't believe that he's saying, I want to become emperor, and the only way to become emperor is insane-e-kamil, therefore I'm going to do all this kind of crazy stuff with the Upanishads and all. He's not doing that. This is an intellectual journey all unto itself. But it's also happening alongside a kind of political journey. And those will intersect at various points, and that was kind of the argument that I was trying to make. Because again, I'll just say, not to beat a dead horse over here, you read anything about Dara Sukoh in Indian textbooks or anywhere, right? My own supervisor wrote a book called The Mughal Empire, very unimaginative title, but you get what the book is about. And he also was like, Dara was this, really nice guy, and, he's just such a sweet fellow. Aurangzeb is this dastardly character. Now, Aurangzeb is a dastardly character, but they're all dastardly. So I would be very skeptical that there is not a real intersection of the two, and but I applaud your skepticism. It's good. The gentleman in the back there.
Is there an English version of the translation that he...
Sir Akbar? Yes, there is.
Is it available?
Yes. Easily available. You can...
What is the title of the English version?
Sir Akbar. And it's easily available. Amazon, in fact, it's widely printed and very cheap, in fact. Lots of Indian editions of the book over the years. The best translation was done by an Englishman about 50, 75 years ago. It's not very good. It's the best that we have. But again, you read the Sir Akbar, and in translation, it doesn't really make much sense. And again, I'm not trying to belittle it. It's like the Quran again. When people say, I understand everything about Islam by reading the Quran, I'm like, wow, you've got a lot more knowledge than I have. Because I will also confess to saying that, without much larger contexts, and without really, again, the Quran itself is an extremely difficult text. It's not what is all on the page. And I think Sir Akbar, it works in the same way. It's not an obviously readable text in a way that, you open up a work of, a scholar of religion or someone like that, and you can, they're making arguments with, paragraphs and introductions and conclusions. It's not like that.
So you say that it's a translation and commentary mixed together.
Yes. And it's very hard to tell where one and the other are in the Persian. Now, in the English translation, they've tried to put markers in. And one of the gentlemen who's done a lot of very good work back in the 30s and 40s, a man called B.J. Hasrat, did a lot of really good work on, he was a scholar of Sanskrit primarily, but then also became a scholar of Persian, and has done a really pretty masterful kind of, attempt at trying to make sense of this text. And the Iranians actually, more recently, have worked on an edited volume of the Sir Akbar, where they have tried to put in the commentarial, like clearly demarcate the commentarial tradition, but in Persian. So again, talk about the ironies that you've got a regime of mullahs sitting in Tehran who are paying for the Sir Akbar to be reworked in its Persian form, being printed out of Iran about 10 years ago. Sorry, Shipto.
Thank you, Dr. Faruqui, for giving us such a wonderful insight for a period that is also never just an observation, was Dara Sukoh a man of intense intellectual curiosity versus someone who has a penchant for the next gen prophet? Which was more prime signature?
I think he's a man of extraordinary intellectual versatility and interest. This is a period when the kinds of claims he's making are extraordinary. They're not being made by almost anybody else. And if they're being made in the drawing room, very quietly, with one another. You don't go out into the public square proclaiming that the Upanishads are going to be a commentary on the Quran, that Quran is itself completely unintelligible and you can only understand it by access to a non-Abrahamic text, that Islam is not self-contained, that Islam is not the final revelation, that, these are bombshell claims. And I think, you only make those kinds of claims, I would argue, if you do them out of conviction and real conviction. And I think that conviction necessarily is anchored in a terrain of deep scholasticism and intellectual curiosity. He's a remarkable character, despite what I may have said about, well, what would the implications have been had he been the Mughal emperor, for quote-unquote Hindu monotheists. Right? But he's a remarkable character, but not understood the way, what I'm trying to, in a sense, suggest and offer to you today is a way of thinking of him in a way that I would say 99% of all scholars of the period would, that no one has really done this kind of thinking about him, right? Which is an admiring kind of thinking, but also at the same time being conscious of him, not just as this kind of pastiche good Muslim, which is how he's always presented. I think it's much more complex than that. The gentleman over there.
Are there any specific highlights of the translation in association, say, with any revelation in the Quran, where it is attempted to match that you could provide as instances of how you harmonize the two or provide one as because of the other?
Let me give you an example. Maybe that would help. If you can just give me a minute, I'll go into my talk over here because I think there is. Okay, so I think I did talk about this, and I think this is the easiest example I can give. The Quran offers this whole, kind of funny, odd conversation about kitabe, hidden texts, and these kind of abstract tablets that are the source of revelation. And Muslim scholars for years have not, for centuries, have not been able to really understand what this Kitab-e Maknoon is, what this Law-e Mahfuz is, and they have ascribed all sorts of attributes to these specific ideas that are coming out of the Quran, right? So what he does is he's like, look, the Upanishads themselves are a secret esoteric knowledge. That itself is an explication on this Kitab-e Maknoon, this hidden text. Remember, Shankaracharya said that unless you have the possessor of extreme esoteric knowledge and lots of training, you shouldn't come anywhere near the Upanishads, and certainly not, the first Vedic Upanishads. So this is the knowledge that Dara then will pick up on and say, this is how the Upanishads help us understand this reference in the Quran. Without that, we would not, if you take the Upanishads and you just throw them overboard and you don't even know about the Upanishads, it remains a mystery. Then it's whatever you want to do with that reference to a hidden book. But now, because you have the Upanishads in your hands, you can make an argument about what that hidden book is. It's the Upanishads. So this is, one of the examples that I would give. There are a whole bunch of others that he uses. And unfortunately, I'm drawing a bit of a blank because my notes over here are not, my talk is not full enough, but I'd be very happy to share, other references where, very subtle semantic things, where in the Quran there are references to events and moments and behaviors, things like sounds, divine sounds. And he's like, well, how do you make sense of this? If you read the Quran, it's like divine sound. What is the divine sound? Where's divine sound? But he looks at the Upanishads and he talks about, sabda and stuff like that. And that then becomes part of his way of trying to explicate on the Quran. So there are many ways in which he's kind of doing this. Now, does he need the Upanishads to do this? Arguably, one of my colleagues, in fact, Bob Goldman, who's a noted Sanskritist in my department, said, look, he could have worked with the Upanishads, that's what he does, but he could have worked with any number of texts and they would have given him the same knowledge at the end. Like, so the Upanishads themselves, I'm not to take away from the value of the Upanishads, but what he's doing is so, what's the word? It's so linear that, he could have found similar things in other philosophical texts and made many of the same arguments. But he chooses this one. So. Okay, maybe the...
Off the subject, very simple word that I read in a literature about Pahalwa. So Iran Shahs was used to have it Pahalwa in the beginning. And also I read that Pahalwa was a Kshatriya community in ancient times. So we don't know whether Pahalwa is a Sanskrit word or is it a Persian word.
Are we talking about Pahlavi by any chance? Yeah. Pahlavi. Okay. Yes.
So in Sanskrit or literature, I also read that Kshatriya had a community called Pahlavi. Was that ancestry is a Kshatriya ancestry of Iran?
I don't know enough about it. I'll be very honest. I wish I did. I cannot answer that question.
Thank you.
Swamiji, just one more question, please. Please.
I wasn't really clear. How did Dara, how did he get interested in Upanishads? Did he know a Brahmin or?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a great question to end this conversation with. We don't know. I mean, he's the first person to pick up on the Upanishads and then to kind of instrumentally use them in this fashion. There are no other precursors to Dara in the intellectual community that we know of who make this very explicit connection between the Upanishads and the Quran. It's not unlikely that within his intellectual circle, this was part of a kind of you can just imagine a case of Chinese whispers to some degree, where the game where you're all sitting around, someone says whisper something to someone, and and through a certain kind of echo chamber, it comes back to you. Oh, the Upanishads. So it's not unlikely that someone in his intellectual circle who may have been a pandit who had access to Sanskrit suggests to him, oh, well, if you're looking for this, this thing, the Upanishads, or not the Upanishads, maybe the Vedas. And so he begins to translate a whole bunch of sacred texts starting in the late 1640s. And there is a way in which I would argue there's a peeling of the onion going on. He doesn't come to the Upanishads first. He comes to the Upanishads after a decade of kind of searching and scouring and getting translations of, the Yoga Vashisht and a whole bunch of other texts. But they don't quite seem to suit his purpose till he gets to the Upanishads. So if there is an answer, and we'll never know what the answer is, it is probably that he was looking for a long time and he finally comes upon the kind of magic bullet that is the Upanishads. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faruqui. It's a great lecture, what I found it. And so many things. Actually, I was just looking at the watch and I found that more than 1 hour question answer. More than 1 hour question answer. It is amazing actually. I thank you very much. It's a great, I think what I told you in the beginning, he fulfilled. Dr. Faruqui fulfilled our all kinds of queries and we are satisfied. So, please accept on behalf of Vedanta Society and all the attendees our heartfelt thanks and gratitude for such a wonderful, informative lecture. We are thankful for academics such as yourself, and I appreciate the approach of the Department of South and South Asian Studies, UC Berkeley, who do not confine themselves within the four walls of knowledge, but they come forward and extend their and disseminate their knowledge to the community also. I definitely grateful, and as a mark of gratitude and thanks, respect, please accept a small token of gift to the mark of appreciation. Please.
Totally unnecessary, Swamiji. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is overwhelming. Okay. So
Thank you very much for attending this beautiful program. So while going out, please collect your prasad there. Thank you very much.
Swami, thank you so much.